Today we're working on layer 2 of our personal landscape painting, and I wanted to give you a comparison so that you could see what sort of things I did in my own painting to add more detail, more variety, and to create the illusion of space within my landscape. The first thing that I did was think about the texture of the background. So I knew I didn't want to create a lot of detail in the background of my painting. On layer 1, you can see that I only filled in the basic area of the background with just different shades of green. But when I was working during layer 2, I added an additional layer of different shades of green, just a little bit different from the layer down below, and I sprinkled salt into the paint and allowed that to dry. So what happens is the salt absorbs some of the pigment from the wet paint and it creates a texture as it dries. This gives my background just a little bit of texture to reveal that it's actually trees, which was not evident in layer 1. It gives it more realistic texture in the background, but not too much detail to make it appear like it's part of the foreground by mistake. The next thing I thought about was the middle ground and the water, the color of the water, the value of the water, and I was trying to create some depth in the middle ground, so giving it a little bit more detail than the background had by adding another layer of color. In this case, in layer 1, for the middle ground, you can see that for the most part I was filling in with turquoise just to fill in the white of the paper. If you look at the same area in layer 2 of my landscape, you can see that I added another layer with a darker color turquoise to create some surface texture for the water, as well as to create the shadows of the rocks and the shoreline in the middle ground of my landscape painting. The third thing I did during my layer 2 of my watercolor painting was to add more saturated atmospheric perspective in the shadows of the rocks and the water. So in layer 1, I created a shadow on each rock in my painting. You can see that every rock has a shadow on its surface with a dark neutral gray. But I wanted to create the illusion of space in my landscape, and I know that one of the ways I can do that is to use atmospheric perspective, where the colors in the foreground of the painting are more saturated than the colors in the background. So if I look at the shadows on the rock that's in the foreground, you can see that I added another layer of a sort of blue-violet color, and I did not do that to the rocks that were in the background. I left those with that more neutral, muted shade of gray. So all of the rocks have a shadow, but the rocks in the foreground have more saturated color for their shadows than the ones in the background, which makes them stand out more to the viewer of the landscape painting. The final step for my layer 2 of my landscape painting was that I wanted to create more texture and detail in the rocks in the foreground as well. I didn't want to leave just texture in the trees in the background. I wanted to be able to see the textured surface of the rocks in the foreground. So I did that in two ways. One way was that as my paint dried, you can see that I added a little bit of texture with a colored pencil. So if I compare layer 1 with layer 2 shows that there is a bit of a texture. The surface of these rocks that are in the middle ground have the texture from the colored pencil, where I just layered a little bit of pencil over the shaded or shadowed areas of the rocks to reveal that they were rough and bumpy. I did not do that in the background on the rocks. I did not add the texture of the rocks far away because if they were in the distance, I would not be able to see as much detail. I also used a watercolor technique to add more detail or texture to the rock that is closest to the viewer in the foreground. If you look at this area of the largest rock in this landscape painting, you can see that within the blue-violet shadows that I added, there's actually this unusual texture in the paint. And the way that I did that was I painted loose, liquidy blue-violet paint, and then before the paint was dry, I pressed a crumpled piece of plastic wrap into the surface of the paint to create sort of puddles that make shadows and highlights within the paint color itself. And I allowed that to dry. So when my painting was dry, I peeled the plastic wrap off, and you can see that wherever the plastic wrap was touching the surface of the paper or sticking in the paint, it makes little cracks and crevices within the paint as it dries. So I thought that was a more abstract way of adding some detail and texture to a rock up close rather than trying to paint realistic details and make my image identical to the photo. I decided to use the watercolor technique to create more detail, but using a more abstract method. Next, it's your turn to complete layer 2 of your personal landscape painting. Think about how you can use the techniques you practiced during this unit to create variety and the illusion of space in your own landscape painting.